ATP. We love it. You'll find ATP in so much of our science art, whether it's a GIF of a mitochondrion or cell transport, or a comic about cellular respiration or fermentation, you'll see ATP mentioned. So why the big deal? Why is it all over the place? Many times students will get it in their mind that it is an energy currency of some kind. When I first started studying biology, I noticed that in textbooks, it's often represented like this starburst thing or thunderbolt. And, I guess in my mind, I imagined it was like some big blast of energy that helped the cell do things. And by do things, I mean that we need ATP to do many cellular processes. Examples include active transport, such as when a cell is trying to move something against its concentration gradient, or its role in muscle contraction with the actin and myosin cross bridge. We need another video for that. ATP is critical for many types of cell signaling. You need your cells to be able to communicate. Those are all just some examples. But what is ATP? How do we get it? And how does it work? Those are the basics of what we're going to focus on in this short video. So what is ATP? If you remember the 4 major biomolecules, ATP would fit in with nucleic acids. Yes, like DNA and RNA. ATP is a nucleotide derivative, so it has those 3 parts you'd see in DNA or RNA nucleotides: phosphate, sugar, base, but it actually has 3 phosphates. ATP is short for its full name, adenosine triphosphate. This fancy name is helpful as it tells you that it contains the nitrogenous base known as adenine and 3 phosphates, hence the tri in adenosine triphosphate. Its sugar is ribose. How do you get ATP? All cells need ATP, and so they need processes that can be used to generate it. But the process can differ. It might involve oxygen, such as aerobic cellular respiration. It might not involve oxygen, such as anaerobic respiration or fermentation. During cellular respiration, plants break down the glucose they made from photosynthesis to make ATP. During cellular respiration, animals break down the glucose they consumed to make ATP. And it's not just plants and animals. Bacteria, fungi, protists, and archaea, they all need to make ATP. We have a video on cellular respiration and another one on fermentation that can be helpful to understand the process. But one thing that we do want to mention about making ATP is it's important to understand it is part of a cycle. With the ATP cycle, you have ATP, which can be hydrolyzed, releasing energy and losing one of its phosphates in this process. A process like cellular respiration can provide the energy needed to add a phosphate to ADP in order to regenerate ATP again, which is important as ATP can be used quickly. This brings us to how ATP is able to work. So how does ATP work? It's not just about ATP being hydrolyzed and releasing energy, it's more than that. Okay, honestly, it's more than our short video can go into, which is why we provide some further reading links, but let's look at some basics. So when ATP is hydrolyzed, meaning here it involves the addition of water, it's not really that the bond between the second and third phosphate itself is a super strong bond. It's actually more that the bond between the second and third phosphate contributes to this ATP being unstable. These phosphates with their negative charges don't like being arranged like this. The change from ATP, losing its third phosphate, to become the more stable ADP is an exergonic reaction and releases free energy. A popular example for understanding ATP is to use the spring illustration, like a wire spring. Consider how you might compress the spring. ATP would be modeled by that compressed spring, and then you would let it go until it just goes into this relaxed state, which would be represented by ADP. When ATP is hydrolyzed, if the energy was just released, it will likely not be useful for a cell if it's not actually coupled to something that needs it. Thankfully, the energy release can be coupled to endergonic processes that the cell needs to do. This can occur when the phosphate from the ATP is transferred to a molecule that is going to be acted upon. For example, this cell transport protein here is supposed to move some kind of molecule against its concentration gradient. Recall that if it was passive transport, these molecules would be moving from high to low concentration. But in active transport, thanks to ATP, this protein can move them against the gradient. When the phosphate is transferred to this protein, we say the protein has been phosphorylated. Sounds powerful. We can say in our example that this protein is more reactive and less stable in this form, this phosphorylated intermediate state. When it reverts into its original, more stable shape, it can assist in moving them the other direction. So, from marveling at the beating of a single cilia hair, or chromosomes being separated in cell division, or binding the correct amino acid on a tRNA, I could go on. We hope that little ATP symbol will mean something every time you see it. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
On you. And you might remember me from educational biology videos such as what is aerobic respiration? And what is fermentation? But seriously though, I have made videos on those two topics, and they're all about cellular respiration. They're the two different forms of cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is where cells break down high energy organic molecules like glucose to release energy. That energy then fuels the ATP cycle. And today's video, I'm going to answer the question, what is the ATP cycle? How does it work? And why do we need it? Let's get started. Okay, well firstly, what is ATP? ATP is this molecule called adenosine triphosphate. That's where it gets its name from, ATP. And it's a really important short-term energy storage compound in cells. It's made up of adenosine and 3 phosphate groups. That's where it gets its name. Adenosine, tri meaning 3, phosphates. Now the third phosphate, I've drawn a squiggly line there to indicate that that is an unstable bond. That bond can be broken, and ATP can be converted into ADP, diphosphate, and an extra phosphate group. When that happens, energy is released. Now remember, cells need energy to survive. And they need energy for things like movement and synthesis and active transport. So ATP enables cells to do those things because when it's converted into ADP, the energy that's released can allow cells to do those jobs. So here you can see in this diagram how that process works. First of all, I want you to concentrate on this bottom part here. This is ATP that we just looked at. 1, 2, 3 phosphates, so that's our ATP molecule. Squiggly bond showing that it's unstable. Now with the addition of some water, a hydrolysis reaction occurs and this phosphate is broken off. That means that ATP is converted into ADP, D standing for di, which means 2. And a spare phosphate group over here. So that conversion takes place, and when that conversion takes place, energy is released and it's used by the cell for the things that we just looked at. Synthesis, movement, active transport, all those sorts of things. Here's the catch. Cells need ATP continuously. They always require ATP to break it down to ADP. But if that process was a one-way process, we're going to run out. And that's why we need the ATP cycle. We need another step where we can actually put ATP back together and add this phosphate back on. And it just so happens that because breaking it down or converting the ATP to ADP released energy and was exothermic, meaning energy exits the reaction, adding the phosphate back on to make ATP again is an endothermic process, which means it requires energy, and that energy that is required to attach the phosphate back on and form ATP comes from cellular respiration. aerobic respiration, or fermentation. Check those videos out if you haven't already. So that forms our ATP cycle. The exothermic process of breaking down ATP to ADP and P, or converting it, and the endothermic process where energy needs to enter the reaction, which is attaching the phosphate back onto ADP and forming ATP. That cycle occurs continuously. And an amazing thing is the amount of ATP that actually gets recycled in this process. In fact, in one day, the equivalent of a human body weight of ATP is recycled in your body. Just think about that. So let's say you're 65 kilograms. In one day, your body uses up 65 kilograms of ATP. So let me ask you the question, why are you still here? Why don't you vanish in that day? You got it. It's because you produce 65 kilograms of ATP in that same amount of time. It's a continuous cycle. It's always breaking it down and regenerating it over and over again. So just one more way to look at it. I've got these three cogs here, or gears. Now, let's label these different gears. Now remember, if this one's moving, it will drive this one, and that will drive this one. Let's think of this first cog as cellular respiration, aerobic respiration, or fermentation. Now, that starts moving, and that process is occurring, and the energy released from that process drives the ATP cycle. So the ATP cycle is able to occur. And the ATP cycle is what provides the energy for cellular processes like movement and synthesis and active transport. What I want you to think about is, imagine if we take away the ATP cycle. That process is now not occurring. Cellular respiration can still be occurring as much as you like. But what's going to happen to the cellular processes? Is anything going to be driving those? No. They're going to come to a standstill. So without the ATP cycle, cellular processes can't occur, even though cellular respiration provides energy. It's a chain of events that is really important, and the ATP cycle fits in that really important space. So guys, that's been the ATP cycle. I hope that I've helped you to understand what it is and why we need it in our cells. Thanks very much for watching, as always, and I'll see you.
This video is about the differences between the two molecules, ATP and ADP. To start things off, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, which I'll spell out for you up here. So it's adenosine, ADENOSINE, and then triphosphate. ADP, as you can probably guess, stands for adenosine diphosphate. So the main difference here is just the number of phosphates that they have. To start off, we'll look at a diagram for ATP, and then we'll get into the one for ADP next, sort of like comparing the two of them together. But if we look at this for starters, you'll see that ATP has three parts. It has an adenine, a ribose, and then three phosphate groups that are kind of attached together at the end. This is important because it has like three major regions that you just need to be familiar with. The adenine section is more there just for stability. The ribose is a sugar in the middle, and then the three phosphate groups are actually where the energy is. The energy that ATP carries, because remember that's the whole purpose of ATP. It's the energy carrier of the cell. The energy is actually between these last two phosphate bonds. So when there is an ATP molecule that's used, this last phosphate is actually broken off, and the energy in that bond is what's used to power whatever process it is that ATP is being used for in the cell. So remember, it's used for things like cell transport, for like active transport. Pretty much any time the cell needs energy, it's using ATP for it. Now, if we get into the differences between ATP and ADP, that's where we get to this diagram here. I just want to push this to the back so it gets out of our way. There we go. Alright, so now we can cover up that title. If we're looking at the differences between the two, you got to look up at the top here carefully. We've got ADP on this side and then ATP on the other side. The key difference has to do again with the number of phosphates. You can see adenosine diphosphate only has two of those phosphate groups. Adenosine triphosphate has all three. The way that your book explains this, and I actually really like this comparison, is the idea that ADP is a partially charged battery. So even though it has one of those phosphate groups left that could still be broken off, your body actually doesn't work that way. As soon as it gets down to ADP, that's eventually recharged then through the process of respiration into ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So think of ATP as a fully charged battery. This can be used to power things in the cell. ADP is a partially charged battery that has to be recharged before the cell uses it for anything. So the structure is something that you should be aware of. Again, the idea that there's adenine on this side, the ribose in the middle, and then the three phosphate groups at the end. Just to help you break this down into some simple structure, the first thing that we'll write down under ATP is that this one is fully charged. So this is something that can be used for energy as it currently is in the cell. And this one needs to be charged, or we could say, I guess, that it needs charging. And again, this is part of what happens in the processes of photosynthesis and respiration. Eventually, what the cell's going to do, the plant cell, is it'll use some of the glucose that's made in photosynthesis at the mitochondria in order to recharge ADP into ATP, so it can be used again. Another thing to put down under this one, ATP has three phosphates. ADP, of course, only has two. That's the main difference in their name. There's other things that they have in common, which you should be aware of. The idea that they both have the adenine and the ribose in their general structure. But basically, the simple thing, just to understand about these two, is that ADP is partially charged, and the whole point of the two processes we'll be talking about with photosynthesis and respiration is to eventually end up making ATP for the cell, because this powers absolutely everything that's going on. So if you feel comfortable with the structure, you could label a simple diagram with the parts on there, and you just understand the difference between ADP and ATP. You should certainly be all set for this one. So as always, I thank you for watching, and I'll see you in class.
Whenever we talk about energy, we think about a molecule called ATP. It always strikes our mind. And we recall a famous sentence related to this ATP molecule, that it's the energy currency of the cell. It's because these are the molecules that drive our all cellular processes inside our body. But when this ATP gets used, how it gets recycled? What's the process? Let's find out in this video. So the process where ATP gets used and recycled again is the ATP cycle. First point we see here, it's a cyclic biochemical process that yields ATP from ADP. We get adenosine triphosphate from adenosine diphosphate. There must be any addition of phosphate group here. Second point we see here, there is a phosphorylation of adenosine diphosphate. That means addition of phosphate molecule to the ADP so that we get adenosine triphosphate. And another process occurs in this process in the ATP cycle is the hydrolysis of ATP molecule, which means there is a breakdown of ATP molecule due to the reaction of water. And finally we see the ATP cycle releases energy stored in phosphoanhydride bond. So it's the bond that's present between oxygen molecule and phosphorus molecule, and it must be noted here, it's not the phosphate group or inorganic phosphate that releases energy, but it is the bond between phosphorus and oxygen that has got lot of energy in it, but it's a weak bond, easy to break, and it releases immense energy. Let's see the cycle now. We have an ADP molecule, that's adenosine diphosphate molecule, and we see it has got two phosphates bound to it. And this ADP molecule gets transformed into ATP, that's adenosine triphosphate. So now it has got three phosphates bound to it. That means there is an addition of inorganic phosphate here, which adds to the ADP molecule, making it ATP then. And for this, the energy is required to make a bond. That means it's endothermic reaction here, which needs energy. And we get this energy from a cellular respiration, like glycolysis. After we get ATP from ADP, this ATP is also to release energy because the last phosphate that has recently added to it is highly unstable because of the negative charges, because of the repulsive charges that's exhibited by the three negative charged species, that's oxygen in that case. So here the last phosphate, the unstable phosphate, gets released from this ATP and it's transformed into ADP again, and this reaction is aided by the water, that's there is hydrolysis of ATP molecule, and from this we get the inorganic phosphate back, and there is a release of immense energy because the phosphoanhydride bond is broken here, which has got lot of energy in it. In this cycle we see two types of reaction. First is endothermic reaction, where there is absorption of energy by ADP molecule because it needs energy to make another bond with inorganic phosphate so that it becomes ATP molecule. And when there is ATP molecule, there is hydrolysis of this ATP molecule, it releases energy. That means this reaction is exothermic reaction because it releases energy here. If we see the reaction here, ATP molecule combines with inorganic phosphate in presence of energy, it gives ATP molecule plus energy. That means there's an absorption of energy, there's release of energy. So both endothermic as well as exothermic energy is here. So in order to drive the cellular process, there must be any total gain in energy. So it must be noted here, the energy released is always greater than the energy absorbed in that ATP cycle. So we have a total gain here. ATP plus water, that gives us ADP plus inorganic phosphate plus energy. And this is reversible reaction that makes it a cycle. So this was all about ATP cycle. In the next part of the video, we'll be discussing about how ATP gives energy and why this ATP gives energy and why it is highly unstable molecule than ADP.